Hey, do you guys wonder why Jonah was so resistant about going to Nineveh? Well, in order to answer that question, we're going to take a look at the city of Nineveh. So I invite you on a journey back into time, back into the mid 8th century BC, and explore the city of Nineveh with me. So let's do it. The city of Nineveh. This is actually how you would spell Nineveh in Akkadian. It looks interesting, doesn't it? Oh, just think for a moment what that might look like. A fish, right? It looks like a fish within four walls. Maybe a river going by. Isn't it interesting that God told Jonah to go to the place of the fish, and he ends up in the place of the fish? Anyway, I think the irony is something that Jonah would not have readily missed. Nineveh was named after Ninua, a uh, a goddess of the river, a fish goddess. Okay, but this is just the name. What about the people? What about the culture? What is, or might I add, who is Nineveh? So let's take a look. This is an artist depiction. Obviously, it's not a photograph. They didn't have those of what Nineveh might have looked like in Jonah's day. As you can see, it's a big city. It's repeated several times throughout the narrative. Every time Nineveh is brought up, it's depending on which translation you're using, it either says big or important, large. It comes from the Hebrew Rav, and there's a wordplay there we'll discuss at some point. But and it even talks about it requiring 3 days to visit. Is that because the size of the city would have taken 3 days to walk around, or would it be 3 days to kind of arrange for a visit to the king in it? And there's levels and tiers. So the debate's there. But let's take a look. What is this people group? Well, you might be surprised to find that Nineveh is modern day Mosul. You may have heard the word Mosul a lot in the news 3 years ago in reference to ISIS, who occupied and destroyed Mosul. A lot of violence there. We had some of Samaritan's Purse crowd were stationed there helping victims. But that is, as you can see, this big squarish piece of property near the Tigris River is old Nineveh. There it's set. It was actually uncovered archaeological digs. The locals called the place Nevi Yunus, which in their tongue meant prophet Jonah. So it is interesting that this place has been tied to, even in the local memory, this prophet, a reluctant prophet. So let's take a look at Nineveh. There was a reconstruction project after the ruins were discovered, and some of the reconstruction, kind of rebuild, remake of the gate. So it's been a big construction, a big intimidating fortified city, and this is one of the gates. However, those annoying and terrible people that we know as ISIS destroyed the gate that was there. So it survived millennia until recently. So just yeah, it's a troubled area, and if you're interested in biblical archaeology, there's so much to learn, and there's new discoveries all the time. And unfortunately, at this point in history and in the current climate, there's wars that have damaged these artifacts. So anyway, here's something that would have greeted you at the gate. Yeah, they're not centaurs, they're lamassu. These are kind of deified-looking guardian animals, right? They had the horns, which in Assyrian culture would have symbolized kind of deity, contact with the divine. So these divine kind of statuaries would have guarded, as you can see, the kind of braided beard, which you'll see a lot in Assyrian iconography, this kind of regal look. And the feet, it's interesting if you notice, if you can imagine standing face to face with one, the feet look like they're stationary, like they're standing guard. These divine and intimidating beings are protecting the city. And if you look as if you're exiting the city from within, it looks like it's going out before you, like a procession. in defense as well. So there was certainly some intimidation in their iconography. If you're not convinced about their intimidating iconography, let me continue. Um, these guys were war dogs. They had an art of war, and it was violent, and it was macabre, and it was bizarre. And they celebrated violence, and they were notorious for it. They, in fact, were one of the pioneers of what became crucifixions. This was impaling their enemies on display. This is how they chose to celebrate their own military accomplishments. They also had no qualms about beheading. It was often a way for ancient Near Eastern cultures to take body count, a death toll, if you will, of the enemies conquered by taking a body part. I mean, we do see that to some degree in Israel. Remember that David collected foreskins of the Philistines. The Assyrians here collect heads. And as you can see in their iconography, they're here to intimidate you. They're here to show you that they're a military force, that they will annihilate you if you come against them. They were notorious for their sieges. There's a siege of Lachish. It's a city of Israel that was taken over. The siege walls are still there to this day. But the siege machine of Assyria, basically, if you were assumed by their empire and did not pay tribute, they would raze you to the ground. They had no mercy. In fact, it occasioned innovation. I'm going to read briefly from a book called Illustrated Guide to Bible Battles by Stephen Leston. As the Assyrian threat intensified, the house of Omri, this is about 100 years before Jeroboam II, by the way, introduced a new kind of wall. A solid, thick barricade featuring inset and offset sections to withstand powerful siege works. Without question, these walls were among the most sophisticated and complex in the ancient world. This was the military threat that initiated and occasioned the kind of innovation that made the ancient world's wall technology changed. These guys were a force to be reckoned with. They were a force ahead of Jeroboam. Jeroboam and his Jeroboam II and his kingdom reached further north than any other northern king, and he actually had a really successful reign in terms of military power and expansion. However, the threat loomed large, and in the subsequent decades, Assyria would grow and would consume all the way down to Egypt. Their empire absorbed much of the ancient Near East with this threatening presence. In fact, about 100 years after Jonah's arrival, the prophet Nahum, though it doesn't seem that he actually went to Nineveh himself, was inspired by God to write a prophecy against Assyria and Nineveh and indicted them for their utter and despicable violence. Assyria was a very violent place and a violent culture that celebrated violence. We see a contrast with the Old Testament law that the human body was dignified. There was instructions not to leave anybody on a pole, not to bury the body. There's a concern for human dignity that was, at least to the Assyrians, countercultural. So this is the place he went. If you approach the king, however, you would see some more interesting and violent iconography. They actually had rooms of lions that they drugged, that they caged, and that they used for sport. They would kill them. They would pour out their blood as a libation. This was kind of part of not clear exactly what feature it played, but it seems to be some sort of worship act, pouring out the blood of a lion. As you see here, this lion vomiting blood. Imagine the time it would have taken to carve something like this into stone. These people knew very clearly that they wanted to represent themselves as intimidating, as near invincible. As king prior to the day of Jonah, Ashurbanipal chose to represent himself with this jarring image. Again, this lion hunt idea, thrusting a sword into the belly of a lion while choking it out. They thought themselves invincible. They thought themselves
uh, uh, just dominating the world, right? This was a violent culture, and they wanted to shock you with their violence, and they wanted to intimidate you. And it's if we just embrace that for a moment, if we encounter this culture and try to understand maybe a little bit of Jonah's resistance, not only are they foreigners, which I think is an easy way to paint Jonah's crisis of leaving, but these were the people you didn't want to go to. These were the people that scared you to death. These were the people you didn't want to mess with. So I just, before we judge Jonah, and as we encounter this ancient culture that Jonah is asked from his own ancient culture to represent the love of God, let's just give ourselves a scenario. What if instead today you were invited to go, let's say a few years ago, to modern day Raqqa? Raqqa was the place where ISIS occupied. Remember the siege of Aleppo? So imagine the most violent people group you can think of today. As we mentioned, their impact today at the beginning of this little video, the way they choose to make themselves known through videoed beheadings of Christians. Think of the most violent culture you can think of. What if God today asks you to get on a plane and go to that place? How would that make you feel? We begin to understand a little bit of Jonah's hesitancy. He's not asking you to go hang out with the Swiss or the people in Portland, Oregon, or uh, the Aussies, right? No, I want you to go and tell the ISIS people that they're in great calamity. It would be a tough assignment. So it helps us to re engage the ancient world, to start to understand the nature and character of God and the role in which his people are invited to represent that character. It is not easy to have compassion on the Assyrians or the people of ISIS. But as we see in this story, and it works in our heart, we see the very real, tangible, incredible, hard to swallow compassion and love of God, as even he loves the Assyrian people. So let us learn from Jonah and experience God's character through this tough and marvelous story.